Well, it is good to see everyone this morning. We have a small group, but it's good to see those of you who are here. And hello to everybody on the live stream. Hope that you all get to feeling better. So, suffering is something that we are all going to end up facing in this life. Suffering is a part of what we call the human condition. Now, suffering does, though, offer a little bit of a theological difficulty. There are those who are antagonistic towards God, who have accused God by saying, well, if God is all loving and all powerful, then why do pain and suffering exist? This is the question that has been hurled at Christians for generations. Why would an all-loving God allow people to suffer? And that can be a really hard question. There are people who this question has shipwrecked their faith. They have suffering in their lives. They have pain. They have difficult things they go through. And they ask, why would God let this happen? And we can't just brush that off. We can't just say, well, don't think about it. We need to have a halfway decent answer. So today, we're starting in on a study of Job, looking at faith through tragedy. Now, if you're familiar with the book of Job, I think most of us at least have a passing understanding of it. Job faces some huge suffering. And the book of Job is particular in that it explains why the suffering is happening to Job, but then also details the various ways that people try to address that suffering, and often doing so ineptly. Now, we don't have time to go through absolutely every part of Job. It's a big book. I've tried to keep this down to 4 or 5 sermons, so we're not going to cover absolutely everything, but we'll cover the high points. And today, we are going to be talking about when the righteous suffer, specifically the righteous, not looking at all suffering ever, but the suffering of the righteous. We're going to be studying Job chapter 1 and 2. And in that, we're first going to see the profile of a successful righteous man. We're then going to see Satan's attempts to make that faithful man fall. We're going to have a short step outside of Job to talk about purposes and reasons for suffering in general. And then we're going to come back and we're going to look at the righteous man's response to that suffering. Now, it seems like this sermon is somewhat timely in that we as a congregation are in a point of suffering. We've had a close brother who has gone into false doctrine. Much of the congregation is sick. People in the congregation have had injuries. People in the congregation have had other health-related problems. Members of the congregation have lost loved ones. This is kind of a time of suffering. And so let's look at this book of Job and see what we can learn from it. So we'll start off and we'll look at the profile of a successful righteous man. And it's important that we notice that Job is a righteous man, because the accusation will be made against him later on in the book that he sinned and is suffering because he sinned. But let's read. Verse 1 starts out and says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. That description right there is a pretty intense description. And this isn't the only time that it's given to Job. This description is applied to Job 3 times. Here, in verse 8, in chapter 2, verse 3. Now, those second 2 times, God himself describes Job in this way. So this is an accurate description of who Job is. So let's look at that description to see what it tells us about this man Job. So it said that he was blameless. This is the same word that's used to describe Noah in Genesis 6. Well, 5 and 6. Excuse me. I'm still not 100% better. It means that the person has dealt with his or her sin in a God-approved way. It doesn't mean that they were faultless. Doesn't mean that they never made mistakes. Doesn't mean that they never failed. But that when they did sin, they dealt with it in a God-approved way. Now that description right there is a great goal for us to aspire to, because we all make mistakes. We all fail sometimes. But we should deal with our sin in a God-approved way. It also says that he was upright. This is the idea that he's not a hypocrite. He's not fake. He does what is right all the time. Dan likes to say that integrity is doing what's right even when nobody's looking. That's the kind of person that Job was. He did what was right all the time, even if it didn't bring him any prestige. The text also says that he was fearing God. Now, this is not the word for respect. It is literally the word for fear. People in our society often try to soften these statements and saying, well, respect God, don't fear him. But the word in the text is literally that he was afraid of God. Why? Well, he was afraid of God. He knew that God has no limits and could do anything to Job that he wanted to. Now, right there is a really good lesson for us about our attitude towards God. Because as I said, people try to take the statements in the New Testament that say, fear God, and say, well, that just means respect him. But it's not just respect. You know, I might respect a manager at work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I fear them. But God, well, he makes the rules. He also enforces the rules. He's the one that is the judge, to use a common phrase, judge, jury, and executioner. He's the one that decides whether we get the eternal reward. He is the deciding factor. So he's worth fearing. But this fear isn't the fear of like an abusive step-parent where you hide in the corner and shake thinking you're going to get smacked at any moment. That's not the fear we're talking about. It's that fear that says, okay, I know what his rules are, and I'm going to do them because I know the consequences of breaking those rules. The text also, though, says that Job turned away from evil, was turning away from evil. See, he made good choices day by day, and he turned away from impurity. This shows that it was an ongoing thing. He didn't just turn away from evil at one point, and it was just kind of carrying him. He chose to turn away from evil day in and day out. Now, to be honest, this description of Job is one that any of us should aspire to. But it doesn't stop there. He also cared for the spiritual well-being of his children. Let's look at the following verses. So 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. And then verse 3 talks about his wealth. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men in the East. Excuse me, sorry. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one of them on his day, probably his birthday. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Look at that. He goes and he makes sacrifices for his children just in case one of them has sinned. He is taking great care of his family and also of himself. So Job had the character that all of us should strive to cultivate. He is an excellent role model. Now, we cover that because now we're going to get into the part where Satan enters the scene. The next part of our sermon is about Satan's attempt to make the faithful fall. Job 1:6 through 2:10. We read, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.' You notice how cagey Satan is. He doesn't give a direct answer. Where have you been? On earth. Great. Okay, Satan's being cagey. But okay, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. God himself describes Job in this way. What a testament to Job's character. But look at Satan's accusation now. Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. You notice this accusation is less at Job and more at God. Satan's first accusation is that God has bribed Job into following him. He only follows you because you give him good stuff. Okay, you see where Satan's coming at here. Trying to get into Satan's mind just a touch. He doesn't think people follow God for the sake of following God, or at least not with Job. He thinks Job's following you just because you give him good stuff. So look what the Lord says. Then the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. So God gives him permission. God says, okay, go ahead and test him. Now, Satan uses 4 attacks on Job. We pick up our reading at verse 13. Now, in the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So Satan used men to remove Job's means of food production. Now, oftentimes we read through this and we just say, oh, all his stuff is gone. But think about how these attacks are focused. Oxen are used to plow the fields, used for agriculture. Without those oxen, he's not going to be able to plant his fields. He's not going to be able to make the crops that need to be made. Excuse me. The donkeys would be used as beasts of burdens around the agricultural area. Not to mention all the servants that just got killed. But it doesn't stop there. Notice the wording here. Verse 16, while he was still speaking. So the first messenger doesn't even get a chance to finish his message before another one comes and says, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So Satan used nature to remove Job's ability to produce goods. Now, what exactly the fire of God refers to, we're not really clear. Whether it's lightning, whether it's like Sodom and Gomorrah, fire falling from heaven, whether it's something like a meteor, not totally sure. Different scholars say different things. But one thing is sure, that he used nature to remove Job's ability to produce goods. See, sheep, they're not good for planting fields, and you can't eat them, but their main use is their wool. You make products out of the sheep's wool. Clothes, jewelry, carpets, tents, everything. So now, Job can't make products. He can't make goods to sell. Verse 17, the tragedy continues, and Satan uses men to remove Job's ability to conduct commerce. We read, while he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So camels. Camels are used to haul goods. You can't take your stuff to market. You can't go to market and buy goods if you don't have a way to haul them. Excuse me. This is going to be a long sermon. Not so much for you guys, but for me. But it doesn't stop there. It says, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So Satan used nature again, this time to strike at Job's heart by removing his family. In one fell swoop, Job's world has crashed down around him. It's not just that he lost a lot of stuff. He can't now produce food for his servants and the people in his area. He can't produce goods. He can't go and conduct commerce, so even if he had money, he couldn't go to market to buy the things that he needs. And his family, all but his wife, are dead. That's a low spot right there. Now, looking at these attacks that Satan uses, we learn some things about the way that Satan works. We see that he piles on hardship and trouble all at once. And we see that in our modern world too, don't we? People don't ever get hit with just one thing. There's always a number of different things that happen all at one time. And he attacks from multiple directions. With Job, he attacked from all these different ways. And with us, it may be the same. We may end up with suffering coming from our relationships and from our job and from our health and from our friends. And we may feel like our entire world is crashing down. Satan may use natural disasters, but he also may use human agents. Now, what's that tell us about our lives? Well, it tells us that it should not surprise us when many bad things come upon us at one time. We've all probably been in a situation where it feels like our world is crashing down. Everything is happening all at once. And the temptation very often is to say, why would God let these bad things happen to me? And what do so many people do? So many people, when all those bad things happen, they leave God. They walk away. They say, if God was loving, these things wouldn't happen. I'm done. I'm gone. And you know what? Satan won in those situations. But what does Job do? Through it all, Job did not curse God. We read verses 20 through 22. Then Job arose and tore his robes and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Job stayed faithful to God. Now, we're going to dig more into his response later on in our sermon. But Satan's not done. Moving on to chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And again, the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on it. Same back and forth as before. Same cagey answer from Satan. But now notice the Lord's statement. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Same description that has been applied to Job so far. And then God says this, and he still holds fast his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. He's still faithful. Look at how Satan accuses. Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. What is Satan's accusation here? Satan's accusation is that Job is self-centered, only caring about his own life. the man just lost his entire family. We saw his response that he fell down and wept. But you can see the logic that Satan is trying to use. That, hey, so long as he's got his health, that's all that matters to the guy. Doesn't care about anything else. Everything else outside doesn't matter to him, so long as he's got his health. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he's in your power, only spare his life. So don't kill him. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, smote Job with sore boils from the soles of his foot to the crown of his head. Now, some commentators have tried to say that this was one particular illness or another, and I'm not going to try to say that we know what illness this was, other than boils from head to foot. The point, though, is that Satan chose the most painful affliction possible to attack Job. The most painful thing that could happen. Can you imagine the pain of having open sores and boils all over your entire body? That would be absolutely miserable. And so it says, he, that is Job, took a potsherd, so a chunk of broken pottery, and scraped himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Okay, if we want to talk about a low point in someone's life, losing everything and sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping sores with a sharp piece of pottery is about the lowest you could really think of being. But then it gets worse. His wife says to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Now that's not very encouraging, is it? That's not very compassionate or caring. Now, of course, she's going through her own mourning because her children have died, but the question becomes, did Satan make Job's wife say that? You know, some people have put forth that Satan made her say that. But the text doesn't say that Satan made her say it. Everything else, the text has said that Satan attacked with this way or that way. But it doesn't say that Satan made her say those words. What we see in this is that people may unwittingly help the cause of Satan with their careless words. People may unintentionally be doing the work of Satan because they're saying careless things. So, adding to our list of the way that Satan works, he piles on hardship and trouble all at once. He attacks from multiple directions. He may use natural disasters, and he may use human agents. He may also afflict a person's health. Excuse me. As the coughing preacher is enumerating, sometimes when we're at a low point, we may have our health attacked. We've been there before, haven't we? Bad things are happening. A family member dies. You lost your job. You broke your leg. And then you get COVID. Everything seems to pile on all at one time. That's what we see in life, isn't it? That's the way that life happens. And again, very often people will say, curse God and die, right? Why would God let these things happen to me? I don't deserve these things. And then they walk away from God. And when that happens, Satan wins. Now, we've talked a lot about what Satan did to Job, but we learned some interesting things about Satan himself from this section. We learned that Satan is not omnipresent. He's not all present. He is not every place at every time. Only God is that. He's also not omniscient. He's not all-knowing. He thought his attacks would work on Job, but they didn't. He's also not omnipotent, that is all-powerful. He had to get permission from God. We learned that his basic character is evil. He's not like some people try to put forth today, that some sort of anti-hero like you see in Hollywood's TV shows and things. His character is evil, and he has no care for mankind. He didn't care about those servants that he killed. He didn't care about Job and his wife. He was just trying to dig in at God. And his attacks are calculated. We see, looking at the attacks on Job, that he thought it through, and he did everything he could to calculate what would make Job fail. We also learn that he learns about us from observation. He observes us, and he then learns what'll work, and he's good at trying to make people fall. See with Job's wife. She was at that point where she was willing to reject God. He's also a blatant liar. We've seen this throughout Scripture. Jesus says that he is the father of lies. The plain fact of the matter is that there are things that we don't know about Satan. We don't have all the details of exactly what he can and can't do and exactly how he works. But we do know that he is restricted by God. God restricts his movement. And we also saw that he can use family against us. So he's not all-powerful. He is not the anti-God deity that some people paint him as. He's a created being who is out to ruin God's people, but he doesn't have all power. But this brings us to an interesting spot, because Job's suffering, we can very clearly see that it was caused by Satan trying to make Job fall. But what about everybody else's suffering? Let's do a quick overview of why people suffer in general. And we could do an entire series on this, and maybe we will at some point. But I think it's important for us to look at some of the reasons why suffering might hit us in our day-to-day lives. So, some suffering is what we might call cautionary, meaning that it's a warning. You ever been doing something like lifting and you start to feel that little bit of pain in your back and you know, okay, I need to stop what I'm doing because if I go further, I'm going to hurt myself? Okay, that's some cautionary suffering. In the emotional or spiritual realm, sometimes there might be strife between you and your spouse. And things aren't broken yet. Things are not destroyed yet, but it's starting to get uncomfortable. Well, that's cautionary. You gotta fix things before it's broken. Other suffering, though, is caused by sin. Let's go to 1 Peter 4:15. 1 Peter 4:15 says, "Make sure that none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, or evildoer, or a troublesome meddler." Now he says here, don't suffer as these things, but we also see that people do suffer because of those things. Some people who are murderers, thieves, evildoers, they suffer because of the results of their actions. But they also cause suffering on others. That murderer, that thief, that evildoer, they're causing suffering with their sin. So some suffering is caused by sin. Just leave that open. Other suffering is to test and build our faith. Let's keep reading in that same section. It says, "But if anyone is suffering as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to the faithful Creator in doing what is right." And then also over in James 1:2-4, he says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So sometimes suffering may be testing our faith, like with Job, where we have a challenge to get through and we need to stay faithful. Other suffering may be disciplinary. Let's go to Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12:4-8 says, "You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. And you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom the Father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons." Now, discipline isn't always punishment. Excuse me. Discipline teaches us boundaries. Oftentimes, as we are learning and growing, we face suffering in that we're resisting doing sin. We want to do the sin, and we are suffering because we're not doing the thing we're addicted to. Suffering is sometimes disciplinary. But sometimes suffering is meaningless and natural. Let's go to Ecclesiastes 9. And Solomon writes, "I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to discerning, nor favor to men of ability. For time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, man does not know his time, like fish caught in a treacherous net, and birds trapped in a snare. So the sons of men are ensnared by an evil time when it suddenly falls on them." The point here being that sometimes things happen that are outside of what we think should happen. Some suffering just happens. It's suffering. It doesn't have a deeper meaning than that. It's a natural occurrence. Now, here's the hard part. The hard part is that suffering is often mysterious because God's purposes are hidden from us. We don't know the heart of God at the moment. We don't know what his plans for the moment may be. The point is that we do not, and often cannot know, when suffering results from one thing or the other. Numerous times I've had people ask me, why is this suffering happening? Most of the time we have to say, I don't know. Maybe there's a lesson you need to learn. Maybe somebody sinned. Maybe you slipped and broke your ankle and it's not a purpose, an accident happened. We can't necessarily know at the moment why the suffering is happening. So we should stop asking, why am I suffering? Or why would God let this happen? Rather than accusing God, instead, we should strive to grow through whatever suffering we face. Okay, we may not be able to answer the question, why is this happening right now? Well, just grow. Just strive to grow. Later on, maybe down the road, you'll be able to point back and say, hey, this is the reason that happened. But at the moment, you may not be able to. So whatever suffering you're facing, strive to grow. Strive to become stronger. And that brings us to Job. Back to Job 1, and let's look at the righteous man's response to suffering. We saw how Satan attacked him the first time, that he used men to remove Job's means of food production, that he used nature to remove Job's ability to produce wares, that he used men to remove Job's ability to conduct commerce, and he used nature to strike at Job's heart by removing his family. How did Job respond to that? Job arose, tore his robes, and shaved his head. Now this would have been a common way for people to mourn in that part of the world. Tearing the clothes, shaving the head, normal mourning. And then he fell to the ground and he worshiped. That right there is pretty phenomenal. He fell to the ground and worshiped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." So he he says, okay, I didn't come into this world with any riches. I can't take anything with me. And then he says, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Now, in Job's response, we learn some really important things. He didn't use suffering as an excuse for sin. So often people will do that. They'll use their suffering to say, well, I deserve this indulgence right now. He didn't do that. He also didn't cast blame on God. He didn't say, it's God's fault that these bad things are happening to me. And he did, though, take time to mourn the loss. Mourning is healthy. Mourning is an important part of moving past these sorts of things. We also see that he went to God for comfort. He went to God, he worshiped God, and he prayed. But he also kept the situation in perspective, knowing that God is all-powerful. God gave and God can take away. So what about that second attack? So that second attack that Satan made, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the soles of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd and scraped himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. That's where we left off our reading earlier. That's a pretty low point for a person. Look at how Job responds. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Look at that statement. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not adversity? That's exactly what a lot of modern Christians do. A lot of modern Christians want to accept good from God, but not adversity. There's entire doctrines of the health and wellness gospel that false teachers have been peddling for generations now, saying that God wants you to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. The prosperity gospel preachers would tell you that, yeah, you should accept good, but not adversity. See, Job was faithful to God even when life was not pleasant. Because here's the thing. Faith that is dependent on life being pleasant isn't faith in God. You ever think about that? If my faith is such that I'm only faithful to God when I'm getting good things, is that really faith in God? It's not. It is a symptom of a person putting themselves in the place of God. It's a symptom of somebody saying, God is my servant. He is my slave. I will only accept good things from God. And if I get any adversity, any hard times, I'm done. I'm gone. That's the actions of a gold digger, to use a phrase from our modern world. Someone who's only after the coin. And when things get tough, they move on to the next payday. That ought not to be our faith. Our faith should not be dependent on life being pleasant. Like Job, we should be faithful even when times are hard. So my friends, I encourage us, stop asking, why am I suffering? Or why would God let this happen to me? Instead, strive to grow through whatever suffering you face. James 1:2-4, consider it joy, my brethren, when you face various types of trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect work, so you be perfect and complete. Let's strive to grow, even when we suffer. Now today, as we are wrapping up our sermon time, we've seen the profile of a righteous, successful man. We've seen Satan's attempts to make him fall. We've talked about some reasons why people might suffer. And finally, we saw the righteous man's response to suffering. And I apologize for my voice and coughing through today's sermon. But my friends, as we wrap up our time together, remember that we may not necessarily know why we're suffering at any given moment. We may not be able to answer that question at the moment. So strive to stay faithful and grow through whatever suffering you face. And if you stay faithful through it, if you grow through that suffering, then as James says, you will be stronger on the other side. And as we grow stronger, we can then help others face suffering. We can lend our strength to them and come through these things together as a family, better off than when we entered the suffering. Now, today, we have a small group. If you have a need, maybe you are going through some sort of suffering and you want the prayers of the congregation, we want to be here for you. Maybe there's some sin in your life that you need help getting over. We want to be here for you. And obviously, if you're watching online, we want to hear from you. If you have a need, call us or text us or email or Facebook message. We want to hear from you. So if you have a need, please let it be known as Bob leads us in this invitation song.